Hello students, welcome to the Week 4 lecture on Aristotle. I suggest that before listening to this lecture you read the general overview of virtue ethics that I wrote in the guidance, and of course you read the text, although if you want to listen to the lecture and then read the text, that's fine too, whatever works best for you. But my thinking is that you might get more out of it if you try to read the text first and then come listen to the lecture with the text nearby. Aristotle, of course, as you probably know, was a student of Plato's, who we learned in week 1 was himself a student of Socrates. So Aristotle is the third of these first three great thinkers who, in a sense, sort of set philosophy on the path that it still is on today. And like Plato, Aristotle's influence wasn't just in moral philosophy, or what we would call moral philosophy, what they would have called ethics back then. But he also had tremendous influence on science, on logic, and lots of other areas of thought. And his influence persisted well up until the 16th and 17th century, and even to some extent today. And we're looking at Aristotle as sort of the father, or the founder of what we would today call virtue ethics. Now, virtue ethics is the third of the three major moral theories that we're looking at in this course. And I've been dividing up these major moral theories in terms of which part of human action they focus on. If we look at a human action, we notice that there's the character of the person performing it, the nature of the action itself, and the consequences of the action. And we've seen that utilitarianism focuses on the consequences of the action. Deontology focuses on the moral value of the action itself, independently of who performs it or what the consequences are. And virtue ethics focuses on the character of the person performing the action. And what virtue ethics is going to be asking are things like, what does it mean to live a successful, flourishing life? What are the virtues that enable this sort of life? And what are the vices that prevent it? And what kinds of things would a virtuous person do? And we'll see Aristotle's account of these kinds of questions and look and see what he says and think about its relevance to our time today. And now we'll look and see what the text itself has to say about these kinds of questions. Right early on there in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says that all activities aim at some good. In other words, that everything that we do is done for, at least everything that we do intentionally, for a purpose. It thinks that there's some sort of good that we're getting out of this purpose. And there can be three different kinds of good. Instrumentally good. We see something as good for the sake of something else. Intrinsically good is good for its own sake, not for the sake of anything else. Or some activity might be both instrumentally and intrinsically good. Now, for example, you ride your bike, and you might be riding just to get to someplace, right? So the bike riding, the activity of riding the bike is instrumentally good. You're just trying to get over to school or to the store or whatever it is that wherever it is that you're going. But sometimes when we ride our bikes, we ride them not for the sake of anything else, but for the sake of just the enjoyment of it. Just biking just to bike, right? Sometimes people do that. They just enjoy getting out there and riding their bikes. And now this isn't to say that you're doing it for exercise, because exercise would be an instrumental good. Riding your bike in order to get in shape would be instrumentally good. We're talking about something where it's just the good is the bike riding itself. That's intrinsically good. But of course something can be both, right? You might be biking to get someplace, but it's enjoyable. Or you might be biking to get exercise and to get in shape, but you really enjoy it itself. And that's the idea of it something being both instrumentally and intrinsically good. Now, here's where it gets interesting. What if, Aristotle asks, what if there were some sort of good that everything else aims at? Right? For example, to keep with the biking example, you're biking to get to the store in order to get food for dinner, in order to feed the family, in order to make sure that everyone is healthy, in order to so on and so on and so on. Is there some sort of ultimate aim of that activity that it shares with something even mundane like tying my shoe? Right? Why do you tie your shoe? You're tying my shoe to keep my shoe on in order to prevent myself from tripping, in order to avoid injury, in order to See, this is all part of this idea that all activities aim at some good. Now, that doesn't mean that this is an actual good. It doesn't mean that these activities aim at something that is in fact good for us, and sometimes we might even not even consider it very good for us, but we still consider it good in some respect. So, for example, lying to my mother in order to get her to give money, in order to buy drugs, in order to get high, and so on and so forth. Is there some aim of all of that, some sort of ultimate purpose or point to all of that, that would be seen as, in some sense, good, no matter how awful or evil or terrible the means to get there might be? And so the question is there something that biking and tying my shoe and lying to my mother and all these things have in common? Is there something that they all aim at, ultimately, some sort of common thing that they all strive after? Because if they did, then that would say something extremely important about the question of the function or the purpose of human life, if there's something that all of our activities ultimately aim at. Now, for the moment, he's not going to put a name to that. He's not going to spell out exactly if there is something like that or what exactly it might be. He's just going to give it the name, the chief good. Some other translations might call it the ultimate end or the ultimate good, something along those lines. But the idea is similar. If there is this sort of ultimate aim or this chief good, he says there's going to have to be two characteristics to it, whatever it might be. It's going to have two characteristics. It's going to have to be what he calls final or complete, and it's going to have to be self-sufficient. Now, basically what he means by this is that if it really is the chief good, then you're choosing it for its own sake, not for the sake of anything else. In other words, you're not aiming at this thing so that you can have something more, because then that wouldn't be the chief good. This something more would be a further good that you're aiming at. But we're looking at something for which there's no further point, there's no further end that we have in mind. And what he means by self-sufficient is that nothing is lacking. If we obtain this chief good, whatever it might be, if there even is something like that, if we were to attain it, then nothing would be lacking in our lives. Otherwise, again, it wouldn't be the chief good. There would be some other good besides it, right? So this ultimate end, this ultimate aim, would be chosen for its own sake, and if we obtain it, nothing is lacking. Those are just formal features of this chief good. And he wants to lay them out before he tries to investigate if there is such a thing and what exactly it might be. Now, as a slight detour, and this isn't essential, I just thought this is a point that might be interesting for some of you. You might have noticed, if you've read the text, that he calls the inquiry into this, the investigation into this question of the chief good, he calls it, some translations call it politics, some call it political science. And you might have thought, this is strange, we're talking about ethics, we're talking about the meaning of human life or the point of human life. What does this have to do with politics? And this is a deep and difficult question in Aristotle. And I'll just give you a flavor of some of the things that might be interesting to think about. The word politics comes from the word polis, which is the word for a city or a community in the Greek language. It's the word from which we get certain place names like Minneapolis or Indianapolis, right? Now, if he's taking this word for city or community and deriving from that a word for this inquiry into the chief good, then it suggests something about the relation between my good as a human being and the good of the polis, the good of the community. That in some ways these are going to be very much intertwined. And that's very much what we end up finding in Aristotle once we get into his writings. This isn't about me conceived of in the modern sense as a distinct individual. This is about me conceived of in the ancient sense as essentially a member of a community. My identity, who I am, is tied up with my community, and so my good is tied up with the good of my community. We won't go too much into that now, but it's something I think is very interesting to think about, particularly what it indicates about Aristotle's view of human nature and how that might differ from our own view today. Now, one last preliminary point about this inquiry into the chief good. There's certain things he says about the inquiry itself, what it can hope to attain, what we can expect from there, what kind of understanding we can expect from it. And he says that we're only going to be able to indicate the truth, roughly and in outline. In other words, this isn't like mathematics, where we're looking for hard and fast definitions of things. And it's not like science, where we're looking for proofs or something really concrete. We're looking for a sense of things, right? We're always going to be on the way. There's never going to be an end to this inquiry where we've got the answers. Now, this doesn't mean that it's all relative, that anything goes, or that there isn't anything important to say. There is a truth that we're after here. Aristotle makes it clear. There is better and worse answers. There are things that are just silly, as we'll see in a moment, right? But what it is only going to be able to be indicated. We're going to gesture at it roughly and in outline. And I discussed this a little bit in the written guidance, why we might find this actually kind of a plausible account of how we ought to understand our ethical values. And secondly, we're going to have to begin from what we already know. We can't sort of wipe the slate clean and start from first principles or anything like that. We're going to always start this investigation into the human good and into ethics from what we already know, from what we already have an understanding of. And this means that we're going to have to be mature and well brought up if we're going to be able to really understand and inquire into the good of human life. And this is quite a provocative idea. Aristotle, remember, we're inquiring into something that's true of human life, right? It's not just a matter of whatever anyone happens to think, otherwise there'd be no point in the inquiry. But nevertheless, if you aren't mature enough, and especially if you aren't brought up well, if you aren't raised with the right sensibilities and understandings, you're not going to be able to really have the right sense of the good for human life. You need to be well brought up in order to be able to investigate it in the first place. And a lot of people are very uncomfortable with this, right? It doesn't seem quite fair that only those who already are well brought up are going to have the right sensibilities to investigate ethical questions in the right way. So that's, again, something to think about. And finally, the third prerequisite is that we have to understand that the point of the study is not knowledge. The point is action. In other words, you might think that you're in this class in order to gain information about different theories of ethics and different ideas that people have had about how we ought to live and so forth, and what people have said about that. And you might want this information so that you can spit it out on an exam or in a paper or something like that, and then go on with your life. But Aristotle says that's not really the point. The point is not to gain information or to gain knowledge. The point is to become good people. The point is to be able to live well and to act well. That's the point of studying ethics. It's to become better. It's to become good. And this marks the difference between theoretical knowledge of the way things are. And we might have theoretical knowledge about principles and rules and what people think and so forth. But then there's practical knowledge, which is knowledge of what to do, knowledge of how to live and how to act. And we're asking for practical knowledge, and practical knowledge that is actually put into place. And that's, again, a provocative idea that we study these things not to gain information, but to gain practical knowledge of how to live well. Now, I want us to compare these ideas a little bit with what we learned in Kant and Mill. Remember, Kant was the advocate of deontology, and Mill was a prominent utilitarian. Kant and Mill both wanted to provide something very concrete and very precise uh, with respect to our moral principles. And if you look at Kant's theory and Mill's theory, these are the kinds of things that, at least in principle, could be applied by anybody, no matter their state of development, no matter their culture, no matter their background, no matter how they were brought up. We all have the capacity to calculate the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. We all have the capacity to engage in the kind of reasoning involved in the categorical imperative. And I think Kant and Mill wanted it to be this way. They wanted our ethical principles to be in some ways independent of how we were raised, independent of how well we were raised, and those sorts of things. And Aristotle just says, we can't do that. It's going to be dependent to some extent. Even though, I'll emphasize again, he thinks there still is truth to these matters. It's not just all relative. But it's still going to be, our understanding of it is going to be dependent in a way that Kant and Mill didn't think. And then, of course, if that's the case, then you can have knowledge of our moral duties, according to Kant or Mill, a knowledge of our moral responsibilities. We can know what action would lead to the greatest happiness to the greatest number, and we can know which actions would satisfy or violate the categorical imperative, and just simply not care. But Aristotle thinks ultimately that's not going to be possible according to his view. If you know what the good is, and you understand it, then you're going to act accordingly. That's what it means to have a virtue. And so now, with these preliminaries in mind, we return to the question of the chief good, this thing at which everything aims. And thinking back to our examples we had a little bit earlier, the biking, the tying your shoes, and the lying to your mother to get drugs and so forth, right? Is there something that all these things aim at, something they all have in common? And he says there is. There's one thing everybody aims at, everybody wants, no matter what else we want, no matter what our differences are, no matter what our different values and cultures are and so forth. There's something that everybody aims at. And what is that? Happiness. But the word in Greek for happiness is called eudaimonia. And it actually means something somewhat different than what we often mean by happiness. In Aristotle's view, happiness is living well, faring well. Your life is going well. You're doing well. You're flourishing. Those sorts of things are what he means by happiness. And we all want to have a good life. We all want to live well. We all want to flourish in our lives. And what we're going to look at next is the way that Aristotle considers various conceptions of what exactly happiness is. Now, this is an important point to think about and to consider seriously. In our culture, we're used to thinking about happiness as the sort of thing that's a very individual, subjective matter. Happiness for me is whatever makes me happy. Happiness for somebody else is whatever makes them happy. And it's the kind of thing that I can't, we often think, I can't judge what somebody else finds makes them happy, and I shouldn't expect them to judge what I find happiness in. Is something that we all determine and decide for ourselves. And that's why it's important that if we're going to understand what Aristotle says, we have to look closely at these two features, these two formal features of happiness, that it's going to be final and self-sufficient. That's why he started with this idea that we all aim at different activities. And is there something ultimate that we're aiming at? Is there something we all want? Oh yeah, we all want to be happy, right? But if happiness is this ultimate end, then it has to have these characteristics, final and self-sufficient. So this thing we all want to be happy. We all aim at happiness, no matter what else we're doing. We're aiming at something final and self-sufficient. And what this means is that if the particular thing that we're aiming at, the particular thing we're calling happiness, lacks one of these characteristics, it's either not final or it's not self-sufficient, then it can't be genuine happiness. No matter how sincerely a person believes that this is what makes them happy, no matter how it makes them feel, if it lacks these characteristics, it's just by definition can't be this chief good, can't be this ultimate end that we often call happiness. So we're going to consider some popular conceptions of happiness and consider them in light of these conditions of finality and self-sufficiency, and see whether or not, no matter how sincerely somebody might believe that this is what makes them happy, whether this is true happiness at all. So what are some of these conceptions of happiness that people tend to have that Aristotle thinks are inadequate or not going to genuinely satisfy what it is to be happy? Well, what we're going to find is that some of these conceptions he considers are quite similar to ones that we still have today, 2,500 years later. So they're worth taking seriously here. The first is wealth. Does money make you happy? Is somebody that seeks to gain more and more and more wealth and accumulate more and more wealth, is that going to be sufficient for happiness? And he says no. Why? Well, because it's not valued for its own sake, but for the sake of something else, and so it doesn't satisfy the requirement of finality, being final, being sought after for its own sake. Now let's pause and reflect on this for a moment. What is the point and purpose of money? The point and purpose of money, of course, is to be able to purchase things, to be able to buy things, to be able to obtain the things that we need to live and enjoy ourselves, to be able to buy food and shelter and so forth. And of course, some people do seek out money and seek out more and more money so that they can have more and more things to enjoy, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But for now, let's notice that whether we're talking about the basic necessities of life or whether we're talking about luxuries or whatever, the point of wealth, the point of money, is to be able to purchase and obtain something else. So that's what we mean when we say it's not valued for its own sake, but for the sake of what it can obtain, what we can get through it, what we can enjoy by means of having wealth, whether a little wealth or a lot of wealth. And what's worth perhaps noting further is that not only is wealth not something that is itself what we should be aiming at in and of itself, it also carries implications with respect to how much wealth we actually need. In other words, if we have more wealth than we need to obtain the things that the further ends that we seek, then what should we be doing with that extra wealth? Should we just be holding on to it? And why? Well, because it's valuable? Well, no, we said it's not valuable in itself, it's valuable for what it can obtain. And so this is one way that virtue ethics reasoning works. We consider what is the value of this thing to our lives, to other lives, to fulfilling ourselves. And we see that wealth has only instrumental value. It's only valuable for what it can obtain, not for its own sake. And when we have enough of those things that we seek to obtain with wealth, we have enough of those further ends, then we have to consider what other ends can be achieved through this wealth. Perhaps the happiness of other people, the well-being of other people, perhaps innovation, artistic development, investments, various other things like that. But when we just simply aim at accumulating more and more wealth just for the sake of having it, that, to Aristotle, is a corruption of what wealth is all about. And it's worth noting that this isn't just about what we say, this is about how we act. Some people might say, of course wealth can't buy me happiness. Of course we know that those aren't equivalent things. But they still act as if it is. And this isn't just something to consider with respect to individuals. We can also ask this about businesses. What is it that businesses aim at? Are they aiming at profit for profit's sake? Or are they aiming at a good product, or innovation, or good services, or something like that? What is it that motivates a business to succeed? And of course we know that some of them are motivated by a sense of what they can produce, what they can contribute, how they can innovate, and things of that sort. And others are motivated simply by how much money they can make. And I think Aristotle's talking about something very important here when he claims that wealth in and of itself is not a legitimate end. Again, why? Because it lacks at least one of the essential features that these ends have to have. Now let's look at the next candidate. Honor, fame, and success. And again, we're thinking about what really drives somebody, what really motivates them, what it is that is sort of the be-all, end-all of their actions. And for some people, being famous, being successful, being honored is the most important thing. But why is this not a legitimate end? Well, let's consider for a moment who might fall under this kind of category. And we can think first of all about people who really care about nothing more than succeeding, than winning, or gaining the approval of other people. And we know plenty of people like that. The most important thing in their lives is for other people to like them, or to be noted, to be valued. Or we can think of the sort of win at all costs kind of people, whether we're talking about business or leisure activities or in sports world. For example, I think of Lance Armstrong, the cyclist who won the Tour de France, which is the most prestigious bicycling race in the world. He won that 7 times from 1999 to 2005, and he was regarded as the greatest cyclist in the world for a while, until it was revealed that he had doped. He had taken drugs the whole time he achieved the success. And he gave an interview with Oprah Winfrey a couple of years back after he confessed to doping. And she asked him, "Why did you do this?" And he admitted, "Well, it was because in my mind, winning was everything. There was losing was just not an option." So somebody like that, whether in our personal lives or public lives, that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. And again, if somebody has this as their conception of what happiness means, what a good life means, why would that be wrong? Well, Aristotle says it depends too much on other people, and it's not self-sufficient. Remember, self-sufficient means that when we have it, nothing is lacking. And we might get the honors and the awards for a while, and we might get the approval of other people for a while. But when your happiness depends so much on what other people happen to think, or whether other people happen to recognize you, there's no consistency to that. There's no stability to it. People might like you one day and not like you the next. You might win a race through doping or whatever means you take, and the next day they find out about you and you lose it all. Or you might even win through legitimate means, and of course they don't recognize you. Or you get old and you can no longer compete the way that you once did. Or you get injured and you can no longer have the kind of success that you want. So there's so many things outside of your control and dependent upon other factors and other people that lead Aristotle to say that it's not self-sufficient. You can have it, but there's plenty of things that might be lacking. Now there's another popular conception of happiness that he considers here, and in a way is probably the most common, the most well known. So let's pause for a moment and think. When we say the word happy or happiness, what comes to mind? What pops into your head as an image of what happiness is all about? And my guess is that some sort of state of pleasure or enjoyment or bliss is what you think of. And so Aristotle considers that. Is pleasure or enjoyment or kind of a blissful state. Is that what we seek? Is that what we want in life through all of our actions? Is that what everything aims at? Now, before we discuss what Aristotle says about this, I should note that his views on pleasure are quite complicated and quite complex. He talks about pleasure in an in-depth way a number of other places in the Nicomachean Ethics. So we're only getting a short little snippet of what his overall views are, and again, they're really interesting and really complex. And suffice it to say, he thinks that pleasure is indeed a very important part of the good life, despite the somewhat dismissive tone that he takes in this particular section. But I think this dismissive tone is due to the target of this particular discussion. I think he's talking about people for whom pleasure itself, by any means necessary, is what they really are after, right? It doesn't matter whether pleasure's connected with noble activity or whether it utilizes our human capacities or how you get it or what the rest of your life is like. It's just there's some people who pursue pleasure for pleasure's sake, by any means necessary. And I think that's the target of his discussion right here in chapter 5 of book 1. So why does he think this is not a legitimate candidate for happiness? Well, it's not uniquely human. He says it's fit for cattle, right? This is something that other animals that are not humans pursue, at least according to his conception. And this means that it's not self-sufficient. And remember, self-sufficient means that when we obtain it, there's nothing lacking. And I think Aristotle's idea here, which we're going to see a little bit later, is that the life of pleasure fails to develop, fulfill, and to put into action our uniquely human capacities for things like reason, art, love, relationships, things like that. There's all these different aspects of human life that we find expressed through family, through culture, through religion, through science and academics, and so forth. And so when we pursue a life of just sheer raw pleasure, then we're ignoring all those aspects of human life, and we're acting as if they don't exist. But since, of course, they do exist, then that means that even if we were to have a life of a high degree of pleasure and enjoyment or bliss, there would still be something lacking, because there still be parts of what it is to be human that would go unfulfilled. Now, to give you a feel for this, I'm going to play a clip from a movie, and the movie's called Brain Candy. It was a 1996 movie you probably have never heard of. It was made by the comedy group Kids in the Hall. And the premise of the movie is that some scientists create a pill. And what this pill does is it goes and locks onto your happiest memory. And it allows you to remember it, to relive it, to experience it again. But it ends up malfunctioning a little bit, or having an unintended side effect. And the side effect is that it ends up locking the person into that state of mind, into reliving this experience over and over and over again, basically permanently. Now, logically, if pleasure or enjoyment or bliss, if that were the ultimate end, that were really, truly happiness, then the woman we're going to see in this clip should be the happiest person on earth. And when you get to the end, ask yourself, is this person truly happy? Is this person's life really going well? So here's the clip.
Easy. Easy, patient 957, and open.
What will this do?
Well, what it does is reaches into your brain chemically and locates your happiest memory chemically, and then locks onto that emotion and freezes it chemically, and then it keeps you happy.
Chris? She's depressed, not stupid.
Come on. Just take it.
All right. Coming! Merry Christmas! Oh, that's all right.
Yeah, sorry we're a few hours late there, Mom, but you know how the kids hate old people.
Oh, well, that's all right, as long as we're all together now, eh?
Yeah, that's the important thing. So how's your health there, Mom? You doing okay?
Oh, good. Just a touch of the sciatic. Oh, well, there.
So here, Dad's dead. Yeah. Hey, is that eggnog?
Oh, yeah, go have yourself a glass. I'm going to go check on the bird. I thought we'd have yams this year. We got ourselves a butterball, because remember last year was so dry. And Vertebrine said that they're the best.
Gotta go.
Oh.
Come on, kids, in the car. Come on, let's go.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Mom, we gotta go.
You're
know,
off.
But hey, you got that gift
Okay.
for my mom?
Oh, yeah. Merry Christmas, Mother Hurricane.
Oh!
Come on.
Thanks, I wonder what that is.
The harmonica.
Well, see you next year. Oh, that was lovely.
Now, I asked you before we watched the clip to consider whether this woman is truly happy at the end of the clip. Sitting in this chair, locked into this kind of mental state of reliving this Christmas morning memory over and over and over again. Is this what happiness really is? Is this a life that's fulfilled? If this is this what we aim at in life? Would we say her life is going well? And sometimes people's temptations are just to sort of revert back to the old whatever works for you kind of attitude. If this is what brings her happiness and this is what makes her feel good, then who am I to judge? But for Aristotle, there's going to be several problems with this attitude. First of all, there's the experience she's remembering itself. It's this Christmas morning thing. And of course, Christmas morning is often what we associate with moments of enjoyment and pleasure and bliss. But in her case, her son and his family come over, and they're clearly pretty lousy people. Her son obviously does not have a relationship with his mother. He does not call her or talk to her or anything like that. He's ungrateful to her. Her grandkids are disrespectful. They're self-absorbed, and they could care less about her. And yet she doesn't seem to realize that. And she sees just this short visit with a pretty wretched family is perceived by her as wonderful. And we clearly see that she is in some ways deluded. We know what a good relationship ought to be like with your son and with your grandkids and with your daughter-in-law. And clearly that's not the case here. And yet she doesn't seem to perceive that. So her bliss, her enjoyment is based on delusion. And that's the first problem with this idea that pleasure is the ultimate end. If it were, then there would be no difference between a person like her who has this kind of sense of pleasure or enjoyment or bliss based on a delusion versus one based on something real. But the key here is to ask ourselves, what is it that we aim at? What is it that we really want? If I pursue a good relationship with my kids or with my spouse or with my friends, do I simply want pleasure from that? Or do I want a real relationship? Do I want there to be something actually good there in that relationship? And I think most of us would say, no, we want an actually good relationship. We don't want a relationship that merely seems good, so long as we're deluded and so long as we're blind. We want an actually good relationship. We don't want to just believe that our spouses are being faithful to us. We want our spouses to actually be faithful to us. So that's kind of the idea here. When we consider what it is that we aim at, what it is that we really want in life, and we associate happiness with that, we can see how a life of pleasure or enjoyment or bliss may not satisfy that, may not actually fulfill what it is that we want. But the second aspect of this clip that's important is the fact that it's just bliss and nothing more by the end of this clip. She's just sitting in her chair. She's not doing anything. She's just locked into a mental state. So again, it raises the question, what is it that we are aiming at in life? Are we aiming at just feeling a certain way? Or are we aiming at doing certain things and living a certain way? We'll have a chance to return to this question in just a few moments. But now, let's briefly consider the last candidate for happiness. Aristotle asks whether a life of virtue, just in itself, is sufficient for happiness. In other words, some people might think that so long as we're good people, so long as we're just virtuous people, that's enough for a life that's lived well, for a flourishing life. But what may come as a surprise is that Aristotle says, no, it's not. One can be a virtuous person, and one's life might still not go well. And so virtue by itself is not self-sufficient. And there's lots of reasons for that Aristotle gives here and in other parts of his discussion. For one thing, virtue needs resources and occasions to exercise itself. For instance, if I'm a generous person, I have the virtue of generosity, but I don't have anything to offer, to give to people, then I can't exercise that virtue. And he brings up the example elsewhere of a person who is very virtuous and completely good, maybe we would even say saintly, and yet is being tortured. So imagine that for a second. Imagine somebody, a Mother Teresa type or something like that, or the most virtuous person you can think of, and they're suffering miserably. They're being tortured, or perhaps their loved ones are being tortured, or something like that. Would you look at that person and would you say, yes, their life is going well? They are flourishing as a human being. I think most of us would at least doubt that. And Aristotle certainly did. He said nobody's going to call this person happy. Nobody's going to say this person's really living well unless they were sort of defending a thesis. In other words, unless they had these theoretical ideas that they had to defend and they weren't sort of looking at the reality of the situation. So this leads him to say that while virtue is essential to happiness, it's not enough. We need external goods. We need to be in a good situation in our lives, to really be flourishing and to really be living well. So we have this abstract idea of the chief good, and we looked at various candidates for it, and we've seen that there's something lacking in them. They can't quite fulfill what it is that we aim at insofar as we're human beings. Now, earlier we talked about how the characteristic activity or the function or the purpose of something is essential to talking about what a good something is. For example, whatever the function of cycling or being a student or living in a community or whatever is, then a good cyclist, student, or citizen does this well. and a virtue is what needs to perform its function well. Now, to give you a sense of what he's talking about here, think about a question that might seem at first totally unrelated. Would I ask you, what is a knife? How would you answer that? Think about it for a second. My guess is that in answering the question, what is a knife, you're going to say something like, well, a knife is this thing that you use to cut stuff and whatever. And notice what you're doing here. You're giving a definition of what a knife is in terms of what it does, in terms of its characteristic activity or its function. If we were to talk about what a coyote is, then we could talk about DNA and we could talk about things like that. But what we would probably end up doing when describing what a coyote is, we would talk about things like it hunts in packs and it gives milk to its young and things of that sort. And based on this definition of what a coyote is, in terms of what it does, we can distinguish between a coyote that's flourishing and that's living well and one that's maybe not living so well. And the same thing can go of sports, for instance. What is a running back on a football team? And to explain to somebody who might not know what is very much about football, to explain to somebody what a running back is, you're going to talk about what running backs do, right? What their function is on the football team. And you're going to have to be specific. You can't say, well, a running back is this guy who runs, because pretty much everybody on the football team runs. And you're not going to say a running back is this person who tries to score touchdowns, because again, at least half the team tries to do that. You're going to have to be specific what makes a running back, as opposed to some other position on the field. What is a college student? Right? Similar sort of thing. To answer the question about what a college student is, we're going to talk about what a college student does. What are some characteristic activities of college students? What kinds of things separate a college student from, say, a casual learner? And we might even ask similar questions about what an online college student is. What distinguishes an online college student from a college student at an on-the-ground university, right? And we're going to be, again, talking about these things in terms of characteristic activities, what they do characteristically. And all these things indicate the telos of something, right? And the telos of human life is going to lie in the characteristic activity of human lives. What is the function? What is the purpose? What is the end of human life? What is the characteristic activity of human life? And just like a good running back, or a good student, or a good coyote, or a good knife for that matter, is going to be defined in terms of fulfilling this function and doing it well. A good human life, a happy human life, one that lives well and fares well, is going to be a human life that fulfills this characteristic activity of a human life and does it well. So what is this characteristic function of a human being? What is it that we do as human beings and that makes us special, that distinguishes us from other animals? And Aristotle's answer is this: an activity of soul which follows or implies a rational principle. By which I think he basically means our ability to consciously, deliberately, and rationally make decisions and think about things and inquire about things and explore our lives, explore the world, and reflect on what we find there. Other animals, of course, have feelings, they have lives, they have cares, they maybe even love to some extent, but humans have this unique capacity to reflect on ourselves and to follow through with our reflections, to ask questions, to seek answers, and to make decisions on the basis of what we think are good reasons. All that conscious activity is something special about human life. And so, a good life, a happy life, is one that fulfills this capacity we humans have for this kind of conscious, deliberate, reflective life. And based on this definition, he defines the human good as an activity of soul exhibiting excellence or virtue, and if there are more than one excellence or virtues, in accordance with the best and most complete over a complete life. Now that might strike you as rather vague and abstract, and it is. But remember that Aristotle said that we can only give an indication of the truth of these things sketchily in an outline. And he's going to go on in the rest of the book to sort of try to fill in these details. What does it mean to exhibit excellence or virtue? What are the virtues? And so forth. But there's a few things we can note from this preliminary definition here. We can at least rule out certain things that happiness is not. We've already seen a few. We've already seen that happiness can't be wealth, or honor, success, or pleasure, or even a life of virtue by itself. But now we can add a few more things. He says it's an activity of soul over a complete life. So happiness is not moments of bliss. It's not Christmas morning. It's not the feeling I had when I got a raise. Just like being a flourishing, successful running back would not be scoring one touchdown in one game over the course of one career, right? You say that's a great moment, but to say that somebody is a successful and flourishing running back, we want to talk about what they do overall. And likewise, to say that somebody's happy, to say that their life is flourishing and going well, we're going to talk about their life overall, not moments of bliss. Furthermore, we're not talking about subjective, internal, or psychological states. We saw this again in the movie clip from the Kids in the Hall movie, Brain Candy. Right? There's something very perverse about saying that woman who's experiencing something inside of her head is really flourishing or living well. So we think that happiness is something that is beyond what we happen to be feeling inside of our heads. Or at least most of us want that. And even if we don't, Aristotle says that to live a human life is to actually live, to engage in the world, to be active in the world, not to be inside my head. And so to fulfill what human life is all about, it's not enough just to have good feelings inside of my head. It's to be living well out there in the world. And finally, happiness is not something easily acquired or lost. Just like being a successful musician or athlete, or student for that matter, requires a lot of hard work and dedication and training and effort. To live a successful human life is something that requires a lot of dedication, training, and effort. In fact, Aristotle even says at one point, we can't really call somebody happy, perhaps, until they die, because we don't know how long-lasting, how deeply rooted these kinds of virtues are. We don't know what might befall them, what misfortunes might befall them at some point in their lives. And of course, as we will see later, the virtues themselves, the qualities of character I need to live a successful life, those are hard to obtain, but they're also hard to lose. And indeed, I think that if we look at some of the people in our own lives, or that we know of, that we would point to and say, yes, they have lived well. They have had a good life. My example is my grandmother. We say, yes, they struggled a lot, and they worked a lot, but there is something deep in their character that leads me to say that their life was good. And perhaps it's worth considering this in contrast to some of the ways that happiness is presented in our popular culture. I did a search on the bookseller website Amazon recently to just see what would come up if I typed the word in happiness. And here's what came up. All these different books about being happy quickly, being happy spontaneously, being happy now, and how we just follow a few simple steps and we can be happy. And hopefully now you can see that this is quite different from what Aristotle had in mind. And for all that these books might be helpful and might be useful as we pursue happiness, it's misleading to think that all we have to do is follow these simple steps and we can be happy quickly and spontaneously. Or at least Aristotle would think so. The next lecture will talk about Chapter 2, in which Aristotle discusses the virtues themselves. What are the virtues that enable us to live a successful, flourishing life? How will we know them, and what kinds of actions are they going to lead to? So, I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you'll tune in to the next lecture.